Well, great. Again, thank you all for being here today, and I'm so excited to be welcoming David Hall. David is a partner at Revolution Ventures, and Revolution is a company an investment firm that we've invested in a number of companies with, and I've known for a long time. And it's probably one of the things it's most famous for is its founder, Steve Case, who was the founder of America Online, which is actually the way I learned to use the internet. Was on America Online back when I was back learning the internet I think in the 80s. And so it's always been a role model to me through many parts of his journey along the way, and a great advisor to me and to Capital Factory as we've grown over the past 10 years. And that's part of how I got to know David. So, David, thanks so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to being a venture capitalist at one of the top VCs in the country.
Yeah, sure. First, can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up just to make sure? Perfect.
We got you.
It's so awesome to be here with you and with everybody listening in and watching in. It's first amazing what technology can do to be able to, in the midst of this crisis, be able to connect like this. And unfortunately, I wish this were live. It was one of the events I was looking forward to. But like our spring break and like everything else, we've had to readjust our expectations to focus on sort of the things that really matter. And I think having forums and opportunities like this really do matter, to have communities, particularly communities of color, come together to talk about both the entrepreneurial journey, venture capital, and the whole nine yards. So it's great to do this. It's great to do it in this forum. I was, as I'm sure many of you on the phone have been over the last couple of days, on lots of Zooms with family members to celebrate Easter or Passover or what have you. And there's nothing as funny as 25 Black folks trying to use Zoom for the first time of various age groups. It took us about 30 minutes just to get the consensus down. So it was great to have
Imagine trying
everybody
to
on.
sing Passover songs. That was my experience, was trying to get everyone to sing a song at the same time. That was a lot of fun.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine. But to answer your question, Josh, and let me also say thanks to Capital Factory. You guys have been a great partner, a great voice in both entrepreneurship and the startup support world, because we know it takes a lot of effort to bring a product to market, to convince somebody to leave their job, to start and build and raise money for a new technology or a new company. And it takes people like you who are passionate visionary leaders to help keep that charge alive. And you've done it throughout Texas and throughout the country. And hats off to you for being sort of an ally that particularly entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color need at this moment. So thanks to you. Finally, let me get to answering your question. How did I as the accidental VC end up in this role? It started. I started my career as an investment banker. I graduated from Morehouse College, left Morehouse, and went to Wall Street. I worked for a couple of years in New York, and then the internet, the first wave of the dot-com era was created, and I left New York to go work in Boston for a small startup called Akamai. Akamai's biggest claim to fame is it basically helps create these opportunities. It was one of the leaders in streaming, in the early development of streaming, and the ability to get sort of bits placed all around the world so that you could stop seeing the buffering that we were also used to during dial-up. Funnily enough, Akamai's first big test happened on 9/11, because that was the first big tax on the traditional rails of the internet, and Akamai sites were so well distributed across the world that pieces of content were able to flow from take the sort of path of least resistance to get to the edge of the internet, so people could actually consume the news and see the video. So it's funny to see how technology sort of leapfrogs over time. I left Akamai, went to business school, left business school, and one of the things while in business school I was fascinated by was how disruption was affecting lots of industries, how technology-enabled disruption was affecting lots of industries. And the industry I got focused on, strangely, was local media. It's a huge industry, lots of local newspapers and television stations that own and control a virtual monopoly in their city. And I was obsessed with it. I started researching companies. The one company that had kind of everything that I was looking for under one house happened to be the Washington Post company. And so that brought me to Washington, D.C., which is where I live today. And it was a great example of a local media company that was, fighting the good fight, but had, television stations, a cable company, obviously the Washington Post flagship newspaper, but it also owned Kaplan Education, which I suspect many of you have bought books or attended classes through Kaplan. And so it was a diversified media company, but it was really each of those businesses was being disintermediated by technology. Loved that my time there, and then one day read about a guy named Steve Case who was building sort of the next generation investing platform that was focused on leveraging disruption in both companies and industries like healthcare, like financial services, like transportation, that were so where the voice of the consumer had never been really listened to, and they were really accentuating on that voice. And it was also looking at places and regions that resonated with me more than necessarily Silicon Valley and Boston. So I jumped at the shot to join Revolution. That was about 14 years ago. And it's just been, wow. I joined with the expectation of sort of working and being a general manager in like a Revolution business. But one thing led to another, and the challenges kept getting more significant. And we started looking much more like an institutional venture capital firm that I've been fortunate enough to ride the wave, grow from a junior person to get promoted. And then we launched, and I founded with Steve and another one of my partners, Anna Mason, the Rise of the Rest Fund, which has been sort of the pinnacle, the most fun I've ever had in being able to help
quite a few companies through that.
Yeah, so the Rise of the Rest Fund is we are about 130 companies. All of them invested outside of San Francisco, Boston, and New York exclusively. So we invest in places like Chicago, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Nashville, Phoenix, Pittsburgh, and every other place in the country except for those three cities. Couple points about that. It's a $150 million first fund. We raised a successor $150 million fund last October. Timing is everything in this business. Those two funds collectively have about 40 or so of the best, most well-known business leaders as LPs, people like Jeff Bezos, Howard Schultz, Ray Dalio, Meg Whitman, Tory Burch, and the list goes on. And one of the things when we went out to those investors and those business leaders as individuals and said, will you invest in us? It was really in recognizing that there's something missing, and there's such an overabundance of focus on the coasts and the coastal investors that there's a big country in the middle that with lots of ideas and lots of smart people and lots of innovators that are just being overlooked and literally flown over as people, go from San Francisco to New York and back. And so we've been deploying out of Fund 2 recently, but we still got a little bit of powder in Fund 1. And the goal is really to look for fantastic entrepreneurs who are building great companies that are challenging tough problems, and they're doing it in regions that aren't used to having that sort of that level of early stage capital. One of the things I will say, we are unlikely to probably do a dating app because the world, God knows, has enough dating apps. But the businesses that we're tackling, we think are the businesses that we're investing in, we believe are tackling relatively challenging problems, and we're just thrilled to be at this effort.
Yeah, well, that's great. Hey, and I'm with you. Like I think there's a lot of dated and oversaturated ideas, but then you come along and there's a Bumble, right? And I would love to invest in Bumble. Like that's a great dating app. So you never know, right? But I hear your point, and I agree. I think there's so much interesting, disruptive, new, innovative things coming, and there's only going to be more of that with all the challenges we're facing today. So. Yeah. Let's talk about some of the examples of some of the companies that some of the people listening might have heard of, because I know there's a bunch that you've invested in Texas. Who are some of the companies that you've invested in? I know I can name some we've done together. I know.
Are you going to quiz me? Is this a test?
No, every time we ever. Let me start. I'll start. So ShearShare, one I know we both know really well. A great Dallas company.
So ShearShare is a phenomenal example of a couple of things. So one of the things that we haven't talked about, Josh, and I think it's important to highlight, Rise of the Rest, about 44% of our companies are run by founders of color or women founders. And in ShearShare, it just happens to be both. Courtney and Ty are African-Americans who started, basically, for those who don't know, ShearShare is fractional rentals of hair salon space for other salons. So the salon owner can make money, and the salon, the stylist can also go into another salon and make money. They nickname it Hair B&B, which Josh, you and I don't know much about, but I'm sure there are lots of people who can appreciate that. But it's an example of our sort of looking in places that others are afraid to look, and thinking about businesses that, if you really listen to the consumer and you really listen to the flows of consumer demand, it's a really novel business that has a real grassroots growth effort, but is a phenomenal business based out of McKinney, Texas. So go Texas.
And so when you met Courtney and Ty and Share, give me a percentage. How much of the investment was the business model, and how much of the investment was Ty and Courtney?
So I would split it into three things, right? Like for me, I always say that our investment is, you've heard the people classically say it's a bet on the jockey, not the horse. Well, the way I analogize it, it's a bet on the jockey and the track, right? With the horse being the company, like who knows if Courtney and Ty will be able to hire, a good director of marketing 3 years from now, and that person's going to, come up with the idea that's going to change the business. But as we think about the jockey, people who, Courtney and Ty, they're combined, the co-founders who happen to be married, their combined experience, Ty with his deep domain expertise in sort of being a salon owner and a stylist himself, Courtney, who's been in, technology sales of all things. Like, it was a really strong domain expertise that the two of them shared. You couple that with a market that is huge and growing and has very few technology tools. I mean, we're just seeing barbers and stylists book appointments and have online payments, and it's still relatively a cash business that, at most you call your barber and say, I'm on my way. So, it was a bet on the market being a big, ripe market. And the other piece that was really interesting is how few big brands like L'Oreal, like P&G have any insight into this community or into this, they're all wholesalers. They have no way of knowing who's using their products in the salon, what their products reviews actually are. And so combining that with Courtney and Ty made it a really easy bet for us.
Awesome. So how do you find companies? You've got a pretty unique way of finding the companies for this Rise of the Rest tour.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about our bus tour. This is one of the things that people have known us. We've been known pretty well for. We every year we take a bus and we've picked 5 cities. We'll do a 5-city and 5-day tour. And in that day, we will convene everybody who touches startups. So we'll start in the morning with like a leadership program. We'll invite the mayor, the governor, the president of the local university, all of the big corporations that have big offices in that city, small businesses and startups, and we'll convene a leadership breakfast, basically to let them know that, there are startups in your city, and those startups are responsible for most of the net new job growth. And it's a really important designation that the policymakers and the politicians need to understand as they think about providing resources to help elevate those businesses in their city. We then sort of go out and tour some of the startups, tour those innovators that are doing cool things in a city like Pittsburgh or Nashville or Detroit. And then at the end of the day, we celebrate with a big sort of community celebration. What that ends up doing for us is it gives us access to anybody in any city who's touching startups. We've done this now in 40 different cities. So we've got a great CRM, a living, breathing CRM with thousands of names in it for people who touch startups in places as off the beaten path as Birmingham, Alabama, which, is a great city run by an incredible mayor, but not known very well for startups until a company like Shipt, which was acquired by Target, actually exits, and people are like, whoa, there's some real stuff going on in Birmingham. There's some real strong tech talent. And so we were able to really, really acquire insight into these communities and be able to really access the deal flow that's coming out of a lot of these cities.
That's great. Well, it was an inspiration for us. As you know, we've done a bunch of our own bus trips. We do them around Texas, and that was a big inspiration for our tours. And we learned a lot from what you were doing, and incorporated that into how we help tie together things happening around Texas. So thanks for sharing and helping us.
There's no pride in authorship.
So reminder to everybody as we're going through this, if you have questions and other things that come up, please do type them into, man, you might have to help me out, either the Q&A or the chat, whichever one you seem to be easiest to get them into. But we'll be, I think it's probably the Q&A. But we'll be looking through those to go pull out questions to ask and call on people later towards the end. So you can type those in at any time. We'll be watching through them and coming back to them. So please do put those in. So David, I have what by itself, the question itself is a demonstration of the issue, but because it's kind of ridiculous that I could ask this and think that you might even have a guess at an answer. But how many Black venture capitalists are there?
So the last accounting of it was done by a good friend of mine, Rich Kirby. Less than 1% of venture capitalists are African American that proactively identify as African American. And I think it's part of the pipeline problem is that, both venture obviously there are, less than 1% of of entrepreneurs that get sort of traditional venture funding are African American. And that kind of makes sense if less than 1% of the investors are African American, and even a smaller few of the traditional limited partners, those big endowments and huge pools of private capital that invest in venture capital funds are also aren't helmed by African Americans or people of color in general, and women are a little bit better, about 10 times the number of African Americans, 10% women, 1% African American. And like that supply virtuous circle has been locked for 20 years. And I think we're starting to see some of it unlock. It's still very slow, but I think that starts to explain, why there are so few African American investors and even fewer African American entrepreneurs, because it's a very clubby, closed world, and it's hard to break through in at any level of this industry.
Now, you weren't trying to become a venture capitalist, though, were you?
My career is so much of sort of where opportunity meets
preparation.
Not even preparations, where opportunity meets good fortune. I mean, like where you work really hard and you're in the right place at the right time. And when I started at Revolution, it was still ostensibly Steve's family office, and then we made the flip and started raising institutional funds. And one of the chairs was turned around for me. It just wasn't, it wasn't like I went on, LinkedIn and applied for, a position as an investor. I was hustling it out as, as a junior person at Steve Case's family office. And so it is a pipeline challenge. It's not like these jobs recruit, but I will say, the traditional jobs out of which a lot of African Americans find these roles, so investment banking, management consulting, they are seeing some slight increases in African American consultants and bankers. So that's a hopeful note. There's still more private capital at work all the time. There are a lot more Black partners at funds, so we can take a lens as we look at recruiting, and we take a look at investing. So I think that there are hopeful signs, but it's still a very steep hill. And I saw a chat. I have to respond. I saw a chat bubble that said Birmingham is not off the beaten path, and whoever said that, I agree with it. I misspoke there. Every city's on the path. My point was Birmingham isn't on the radar screen of a lot of coastal investors, and so Birmingham. I'm originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a little bit outside of New Orleans. It's also not on the radar screen, and I think that's the challenge. Is a lot of the cities where a lot of African Americans, people of color live, aren't on the radar screens of investors who are looking to fund, a seed round or a Series A round. Once you are able to cross $20 million of recurring revenue, anybody will get on a plane and come to you. But I do think that there is a little bit of a gap for a lot of those early stage companies that are looking for, the friends and family round or the first institutional round that happen to be in cities that aren't San Francisco or New York.
Well, I get quite a few people coming to me interested in saying, I want to become a VC. I want to become an investor. And to them, no matter who they are, whether they're white, Black, women, men, I'm like, you know what? It's not a straight path. It's really hard. There's not like a way to become a VC, but it must be just like it's even harder to get funded. It must be even harder to become a VC. Do you have any advice for anyone who's listening who's interested in venture capital? I'll tell you, my advice is usually become a founder first. And I don't think that's the way for everybody, but like that was my way was become a successful founder first, become an operator. But Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I think that there are three ways to be a VC. One is to start out with a lot of money. So just start out independently
Got
wealthy
your
and
own money, you
say,
can be a VC.
I want to be a VC. So we'll strike that for me, because that's not how I started. The second case is to be an entrepreneur or be a very senior executive with a lot of domain expertise, for which that expertise is transferable. One of my LPs was a CFO of a publicly traded company. He's now a VC at another firm because he knew how to take companies public, and so that was a very valuable skill that a lot of venture capitalists look for in recruiting venture partners or people to be venture capitalists. So for me, that also was a no-go. And so the third way is to sort of hustle your way through looking at, there are programs like Kauffman. There are a number of programs that are at
Kauffman
business
Fellows.
schools. Kauffman Fellows program, which is a phenomenal sort of on-ramp to getting people into the venture space. There are a number of opportunities gosh, I'm blanking on the name. It'll come to me in a second. But there are some programs that are starting to HBCU.VC that are teaching people. There's a program here in the Washington D.C. area called Score 3 Angels that trains people and puts them on venture internships to get access to that sort of get your foot in the door. Because here's the reality. The reality is most venture capital firms are small by nature, and they don't have a lot of roles generally. And then when there's a chair that opens up because somebody leaves the firm or somebody starts their company, those chairs are flooded with resumes to fill that one or two slots. And so it usually gets to be people have these confirmation biases, and venture capitalists want to expand the network to people who look like them or who they know who are already in their networks. And so the position doesn't get broadcast very broadly. And so these are very small chairs. And so programs like Kauffman are so great because they help feed the pipeline of diverse candidates.
That's great. So as a firm, what does Revolution do to drive diversity and inclusion, to invest in more diverse founders? What do you do differently? Do you just say you're going to do it?
Well, no, I think it's two really direct, easy things to point to. I mean, our partnership has African American and two women as partners. That being living and breathing it, just as we think about sort of investing. Yeah, it's helpful. I think the other thing equally as important is that we're not based in the Valley. We're based in Washington, and we don't invest in those cities. And so our ability to as we look in some of these other places for deal flow, we're really focused on making sure that's an important lens that we look for, and we look. It is my duty to talk to almost every African American founder that I come across, and I will share whatever the benefit of my experience about sort of fundraising or about the challenges with those entrepreneurs. Might not do many of those deals just because we just don't do many deals at all, but also also happy to accept those founders who don't necessarily who don't come from central casting from Silicon Valley type shows of what founders look like. I'm happy to invest in African American founders. I'm happy to invest in LGBTQ founders. I'm happy to invest in founders that aren't sort of the traditional pattern matched founders from Silicon Valley, because I know that there's domain expertise that doesn't, that domain expertise knows no color, opportunity knows no color, and hustle for sure is a skill that knows no color.
Yeah, well, that's true. So start leading by example. It certainly helps to have people investing who are diverse and people as role models who are diverse. And I think that's something we're still working on ourselves, and we've made some progress on, but it's an area that we can improve too.
And then I guess one other point to make, Josh, is, now that we've got a pretty good locus of entrepreneurs of color who are in our network, the best source of deal flow for us are portfolio companies. So companies that are already in our portfolio. And so, the notion that networks of Black founders, I think we've invested in 6 of the 40 plus women that have raised more than 6 of the 40 plus Black women that have raised more than $1 million in venture capital. and it's a great network that these 40 or so women have. But it's also thinking about who's like for the next 40 and who's the 40 after that, so that we can all stay really well networked.
Yeah, that's powerful. Okay, so let's talk about the world with coronavirus and COVID-19 now and in the future. And for a few more minutes, then we're going to open it up to questions from everybody else. What advice did you give to your portfolio companies last week? What are you telling your companies now as a result of all the changes happening, the health changes, the remote work changes, the economic outlook changes? What's your kind of standard advice right now?
Geez, it's a lot. I mean, I think that the totality of what everybody's going through, and and look, I think for Josh, you and I, for many of the people on the phone or on the call, we are so immensely blessed and privileged to be able to have, to not be in a state of trauma at this point. And I think it's really first worth noting and recognizing that, there are a lot of people who are struggling very hard right now, and we need to at least acknowledge their challenges and their struggle, because it's just, we're so immensely blessed. As I relate as an investor and talking to my portfolio, it's funny that, as the cascading stay-at-home orders started to roll, there have been a number of my companies that sort of were hitting the fan hard. I mean, some were about to start a fundraise because they were kind of running on fumes. Those companies have become their challenges have become so much more acute, and their ability to have to, make some real decisive, hard decisions, laying folks off, sort of mothballing projects that were greenlit and ready to go, even like, hearing conversations with investors that completely dried up. Like those are the hard stories to hear. But then there are a number of really, like, stories of companies that were looking to, release product in, first quarter of next year. They accelerated the release of a product. One company, company out of Chicago called Codeverse does training, did retail-based training camps for kids and coding. They released an online virtual program in weeks, as opposed to, a much longer plan that they had. And it stood up and is growing phenomenally, because obviously parents need an opportunity to break with their kids. We're telling companies, look for at least a month or a year of cash. Try to find a year of cash and try to readjust your balance sheet to take a year of cash. The analogy I use a lot is, this is the time to do the orderly Control-Alt-Delete with your computer and like shut it down, as opposed to like slam your laptop down and run out. It's really hard, right? I'm the first to acknowledge that, but the more that you can preserve cash, because nobody knows the end date of this. This isn't like a hurricane that's going to blow over in 2 weeks. It's hard to know exactly how far or how long this is going to last. And so we're telling people to preserve as much cash. We're telling people to make sure that the top people you need are taken care of, because it's hard. We're also, one of the other things that we're seeing a lot of is just the building in of redundancy. One of our companies manufactures a device, and all of that device was manufactured in the United States, except for one switch, which was manufactured in China. And so like the supply chain is being dramatically affected by COVID. And then the final thing is, as a part of this redundancy, is, people, companies, entrepreneurs have to prepare for a big chunk of their workforce to not be fully active or fully productive. I mean, my wife works, we've got young kids. I'm not able to put the 10-hour days that I've been able to put in over the last couple of years. It's just not possible. And so there has to be some accommodation for that, for those of us who can afford to take that accommodation. And then the final thing, it's always keep the hustle alive. I mean, there's still funds that are out there investing money. I had a company get a term sheet last week, and they're hopefully closing in a couple of days. So there still is some capital that's being doled out. It's just going to be doled out a lot slower. There are a lot of our investor competitors who've said that they're not doing any more new deals in 2020. And so I think it really varies. And I think that it's going to be a lot. I think the next iteration of this pandemic is going to see, we're looking at the precipice of a recession. And so that what that's going to mean for entrepreneurs starting new technologies is hard. But the silver lining, and I'm an internal optimist, and you have to be in this job. You know, and you guys have all seen the data and the press about, this is the time when great companies were built, and great companies are typically built in recessions, and they come out of this because you're what's being exposed now are lots of just broken
Big
systems
problems.
in financial services. I mean, how can the government not get millions of dollars to people, billions of dollars to people, because they're bottlenecked by a check printer that can only print 5 million checks a week or something like that? There's technology that can solve those problems. And don't get me started on all of the healthcare disparities, for which there are tons of startups that are tackling solutions that can help accommodate and drive transformational change that really affect people's lives today, that will be the beneficiaries of sort of the challenges that we're working through now.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what about for people of color? I mean, is the advice any different there?
No, I mean, the advice is no different. I think the circumstances are going to be harder. I think it's going to be looking for, it's going to be that much harder to get that investor. It's going to be that much harder to get that first customer. And so I think that, as I think the startups that I've seen that have been built by people of color kind of bifurcate into two big categories. One is sort of just entrepreneurs starting tech companies, and the founder just so happens to be a founder of color. The other is companies that are typically for the African American or for communities of color. And I think that in an interesting way, those businesses that focus on communities of color actually stand, I think, a slightly better chance today of getting funded and getting through the hopper, because the African American consumers of color are still spending lots of money. And I think that there are unique ways to talk to those consumers in a post-COVID world. I think that the founder of color who is building a software company that has nothing to do with people of color, like, I think that business is going to grow and still be able to tap into those markets. But I think that all of the traditional biases that those people sort of confront will be more acute and will be, really tough. And so I think it's really important to really lean on your networks, lean on the people that you know and who they know, and build those really strong networks. Because again, warm introductions are always taken, and it's the cold calls that I think, when was the last time anybody spoke to a telemarketer who just kind of cold called you? The warm introductions are always the calls that get taken. So I would really encourage people at this point, particularly, to invest in networks, invest in taking the time to have conversations like the one that you're facilitating.
Well, that's great. Thank you.